Something about the technology industry's competitive narrative, whose construction the mainstream technology commentary has been performing across the decades of the personal computing platform's commercial evolution through the framing of the platform competition as the visible contest whose participants the market share statistics identify as the combatants, the product announcements whose coverage the technology press provides as the battle documentation, and the user adoption metrics whose quarterly reporting the industry analysts perform as the scoreboard whose reading the competition's status assessment requires, has been missing the specific competition whose existence the visible contest's visibility has been obscuring by filling the competitive narrative's attention with the declared war's documentation, while the undeclared war, whose conduct has been reshaping the computing landscape's actual configuration, proceeds without the mainstream commentary's recognition of its occurrence as the more consequential competition, whose outcome the declared war's documentation has been preventing the audience from monitoring with the attention that the outcome's significance deserves. The war that nobody knew was being fought is not the war that the technology press covers when the Linux advocacy's community produces the desktop Linux Year's Declaration, whose annual recurrence the technology commentary has been documenting as the recurring prediction, whose non-arrival the commentary treats as the evidence of Linux's permanent desktop irrelevance. It is not the war that the enterprise technology press covers when the cloud infrastructure's Linux dominance becomes the quarterly earnings story, whose framing presents the dominance as the specific market's characteristic, rather than the front in the broader war, whose theater the enterprise infrastructure represents as one among several. It is the war whose theater is every computing surface that the connected computing environment encompasses, whose combatants are not the corporate entities whose product announcements the technology press covers as the competition's visible manifestation, but the architectural philosophies whose implementations across the computing landscape's multiple dimensions are producing the outcome that the visible contest's coverage has been missing, because the visible contest's framing has been defining the war in the terms that the losing side's commercial positioning finds most favorable, rather than the terms that the winning side's actual territorial gains most accurately describe. Linux is winning this war, not winning in the qualified sense that the Linux advocacy's community sometimes employs when the winning characterization requires the Carefew-L scope definition that limits the winning's validity to the specific domains, whose honest assessment the qualification protects by preventing the overstatement whose vulnerability to the desktop share counter-argument the unqualified winning claim creates. Winning in the specific, measurable, documented sense that the honest examination of where the computing that matters is actually running, where the infrastructure that the digital economy's operation depends on is actually deployed, where the development environment that the software whose Windows deployment the visible contest's framing presents as the Windows platform's strength is actually being built, and where the emerging computing surfaces whose growth the next decade's computing landscape will be defined by are actually being contested produces as the finding whose communication the mainstream technology commentary's visible contest framing has been preventing. Here is the territorial documentation whose assembly reveals the war's actual front lines and the winning side's actual position on those front lines. Here is the infrastructure reality whose honest examination produces the findings that the visible contest's desktop framing has been substituting the irrelevant metric for. Here is the developer ecosystem whose examination reveals the platform whose environment, the software that runs on every platform, is being built in. Here is the mobile reality whose acknowledgement the war's scope definition requires, as the computing surface whose user population the desktop computing surface's user population. The visible contest framing focuses on cannot approach in the demographic terms that the war's territorial assessment requires. And here's the emerging technology whose deployment the next decade's computing landscape will be defined by, and whose platform foundation the war's outcome in the contested territories is already establishing as the Linux foundation, rather than the Windows foundation whose visibility the declared war's desktop framing has been implying as the default. The first front of the war, whose documentation reveals the Linux winning position, is the server infrastructure front, whose territorial assessment produces the finding that the platform running the internet, the cloud computing infrastructure, and the enterprise application infrastructure that the digital economy's daily operation requires is the Linux platform whose server market dominates the deployment statistics. Document as the approximately 90% server market share whose magnitude makes the server infrastructure front's territorial assessment the clearest evidence of the war's outcome in the most consequential computing theater. The server infrastructure front is the front whose significance the visible contest's desktop framing systematically underweights by treating the server market's Linux dominance as the settled historical fact whose relevance to the ongoing war the desktop contest's continuation makes secondary, when the server infrastructure front's significance is the significance of the territory whose control determines the digital economy's operational foundation, rather than the territory whose control determines the personal computing experience's platform preference. The server infrastructure dominance's practical meaning is the meaning whose comprehension requires the recognition that every website whose loading the Windows desktop user performs, every cloud application whose operation the Windows desktop user's daily workflow depends on, every streaming service whose content the Windows desktop user consumes, and every digital service whose infrastructure the Windows desktop user's digital life is built upon, is the infrastructure that Linux is running as the operational foundation rather than the background fact whose acknowledgement the server market share statistics require, but whose significance the desktop contests of framing minimizes as the specialized market's characteristic, rather than the war's most consequential front, whose territorial control Linux has achieved as the winning position, whose stability the server market's trajectory confirms as the continuing dominance rather than the temporary lead. The second front of the war, whose documentation reveals the Linux winning position, is the mobile computing front, whose territorial assessment produces the finding, whose significance the visible contest's framing most dramatically underweights. By defining the computing war in the desktop computing terms that exclude the computing surface whose user population the desktop computing surface's user population has long since been surpassed by as the primary computing surface for the global population, whose computing access the mobile device provides as the first computing device rather than the secondary computing complement that the developed world's desktop-first computing culture's perspective treats the mobile device as being. The mobile front's territorial assessment requires the acknowledgement that Android, the mobile operating system whose deployment across the mobile device market the smartphone adoption statistics document as the approximately 70% global smartphone market share whose magnitude establishes Android as the world's most widely deployed operating system by the user population metric, that the desktop contest's framing ignores by defining the contest in the desktop terms that produce the Windows leading position rather than the global computing terms that produce the Linux leading position, is the Linux kernel's implementation, whose foundation is the Linux platform, whose server dominance, the server front documents, and whose mobile dominance, the mobile front's territorial assessment, reveals as the war's second major front, whose Linux winning position the Android deployment statistics establish as the fact whose significance the desktop contest's framing has been systematically minimizing. The mobile front's significance extends beyond the user population metric whose Android dominance establishes as the Linux platform's territorial control to the developer behavior metric, whose examination reveals the application development targeting, whose platform prioritization. The mobile user population size determines as the developer's rational resource allocation. The developer whose application, the global mobile user population, represents the primary addressable market for develops for the Android platform, whose Linux foundation, the development environment's technical implementation, builds upon creating the developer activities concentration on the Linux-based platform that the mobile front's territorial assessment documents as the war's second major front's Linux winning position, whose implications for the development ecosystem's trajectory the third front's examination extends. The third front of the war, whose documentation reveals the Linux winning position, is the developer ecosystem front, whose territorial assessment produces the finding that the environment where software is being created, the tools with which the software creation is being performed, and the infrastructure on which the software creation's output is being tested and deployed are the Linux environment, the Linux tools, and the Linux infrastructure whose combined dominance of the development workflow establishes the developer ecosystem front as the war's third major front, whose Linux winning position the developer survey data, the development tool adoption statistics, and the cloud development environment deployment metrics together document as the finding whose communication the desktop contest's framing has been preventing. The developer ecosystem front's significance is the significance that the software supply chain's platform dependency establishes as the upstream influence, whose downstream effect is the software that the Windows desktop user runs, being the software whose creation the Linux development environment produced, whose testing the Linux infrastructure validated, and whose deployment the Linux server infrastructure delivers to the Windows desktop as the endpoint of the development pipeline, whose every upstream stage the Linux platform's dominance of the developer ecosystem establishes as the Linux-controlled stage. The Windows desktop is the consumption endpoint of the software pipeline whose production stages the Linux platform controls, a territorial configuration whose description as the Windows platform winning the war requires the definition of winning, whose scope excludes every stage of the value creation process, except the final consumption stage, whose Windows visibility, the pipeline's upstream, Linux stages invisibility to the end user creates as the impression of the Windows platform's software ecosystem strength. The developer survey data whose examination the developer ecosystem front's territorial assessment requires includes the consistent finding across the annual developer surveys that the Linux operating system has achieved the developer population's primary development environment preference status, in the specific terms that the survey methodology's scope definition establishes as the finding's valid interpretation. A preference whose translation into the development tool, the development workflow, and the development infrastructure choices whose Linux orientation. The preference produces creates the ecosystem momentum whose direction is the Linux direction, rather than the Windows direction, that the visible contest's framing implies as the technology industry's trajectory. The fourth front of the war, whose documentation reveals the Linux winning position, is the supercomputing and high-performance computing front, whose territorial assessment produces the finding, whose dominance percentage the top 500 lists. Consistent reporting establishes as the 100% figure that represents the complete territorial control, whose achievement in the computing domain, whose performance requirements define the computing capabilities frontier, makes the supercomputing front the war's most completely won front, whose significance extends beyond the specialized computing domain's boundaries to the research infrastructure, the scientific computing environment, and the artificial intelligence training infrastructure whose deployment on the supercomputing hardware that Linux completely controls establishes the Linux platform as the foundation on which the next generation of computing capability is being developed. The supercomputing front's significance for the war's broader territorial assessment is the significance of the research infrastructure whose output shapes the computing technology's development trajectory, the artificial intelligence research whose computational requirements the supercomputing infrastructure serves is the research whose output is the machine learning models, the language models, and the neural network architectures, whose deployment the next decade's computing applications will be built upon. And the research infrastructure's Linux foundation means that the computing capabilities frontier development is occurring in the Linux environment, whose architectural familiarity and tooling alignment with the research workflow, the research community's Linux preference reflects as the rational tool selection rather than the ideological commitment. The fifth front of the war, whose documentation reveals the Linux winning position, is the embedded and IoT computing front, whose territorial assessment produces the finding that the computing that is expanding beyond the traditional computing surface boundaries into the physical environment, the industrial infrastructure, and the consumer electronics ecosystem is the computing that Linux is powering as the embedded operating system, whose deployment, the device diversity ranging from the network router, whose firmware is the Linux implementation, to the smart television, whose operating system is the Linux platform, to the automotive computing system, whose software stack is the Linux foundation, establishes as the war's fifth major front, whose territorial expansion reflects the ongoing nature of the Linux winning position, rather than the static snapshot, whose single measurement the point-in-time territorial assessment produces. The embedded computing front's significance is the significance whose appreciation requires the projection of the computing landscape's trajectory beyond the current device categories, whose familiar boundaries the desktop contest's framing employs as the war's territorial definition, into the emerging device categories whose deployment the Internet of Things adoption curve is accelerating, as the expansion of the computing surface beyond the familiar boundaries into the physical environment's instrumentation and automation. The infrastructure that the smart city, the industrial automation, and the connected environment's computing requirements will be running on is the Linux infrastructure whose embedded deployment the current device ecosystems. Linux Foundation establishes as the trajectory whose continuation the emerging device category's Linux adoption is confirming as the expansion of the territorial control that the embedded front documents as the ongoing winning position. The sixth front of the war, whose documentation reveals the Linux winning position, is the cloud computing front, whose territorial assessment produces the finding that the computing delivery model whose adoption. The enterprise computing environment's shift from the on-premise infrastructure to the cloud infrastructure represents, as the most significant enterprise computing transformation of the past decade, is the computing delivery model whose infrastructure is the Linux infrastructure that the major cloud providers' deployment statistics document as the predominant workload environment across the virtual machine deployments, the container deployments, and the serverless function deployments whose combination constitutes the cloud computing infrastructure whose Linux dominance the cloud front's territorial assessment establishes as the war's sixth major front, whose Linux winning position the cloud adoption's continued growth is expanding rather than maintaining at the static level. The cloud front's significance for the war's broader territorial assessment is the significance of the enterprise computing migration's direction, whose momentum the cloud adoption's acceleration reflects, as the enterprise infrastructure's Linux adoption's indirect pathway. The enterprise whose on-premise Windows Server infrastructure, the Windows Server market share, documented as the Windows presence in the enterprise computing environment, is the enterprise whose cloud migration is the migration to the Linux cloud infrastructure, whose workload environment is the Linux environment. Regardless of the enterprise user's desktop platform preference, creating the enterprise computing environment's Linux adoption through the cloud migration pathway, whose mechanism, the desktop contest's framing, does not capture as the Linux territorial gain, because the gain's pathway is the cloud migration rather than the direct platform replacement whose visibility the desktop contest's framing requires for the territorial gain's recognition. The war that nobody knew was being fought has been producing the winning position whose territorial documentation this examination has assembled across the 6 fronts that the honest assessment of where computing is actually running reveals as the Linux winning position. The server infrastructure front, whose 90% dominance establishes the Internet's operational foundation as the Linux foundation. The mobile front, whose Android deployment establishes the world's primary computing surface as the Linux-based surface. The developer ecosystem front, whose survey data and tooling adoption establishes the software creation environment as the Linux environment. The supercomputing front, whose complete dominance establishes the computing capabilities frontier development environment as the Linux environment. The embedded front, whose device deployment establishes the physical environment's computing infrastructure as the Linux infrastructure. The cloud front, whose workload dominance establishes the enterprise computing migration's destination as the Linux environment. The war's invisibility to the mainstream technology commentary whose coverage has been defining the competition in the desktop terms that produce the Windows leading position rather than the global computing terms that produce the Linux leading position is the invisibility that the framing choice produces as the perception whose correction the territorial documentation's honest assembly requires as the reframing from the visible contest's desktop terms to the actual war's global computing terms. The reframing reveals the war's actual status. The actual status is the Linux winning position, whose territorial extent the 6 fronts documentation establishes as the majority of computing that matters, measured by the infrastructure consequence, the user population, the developer activity, the research significance, the physical environment expansion, and the enterprise migration direction. The war that nobody knew was being fought has been won across the territories whose control the computing landscape's actual configuration reflects as the Linux platform's dominant position. The desktop remains. The desktop's Windows dominance remains the visible contest scoreboard, whose reading produces the impression that the war's outcome is the Windows winning position. The desktop's Windows dominance is the territory whose visibility the visible contest's framing maximizes, and whose significance the global computing terms whose honest adoption minimizes as the single front in the multi-front war, whose other fronts the desktop framing's selective scope excludes from the territorial assessment. Nobody knew the war was being fought because the war's coverage was the coverage of the wrong front. The right front's coverage is this examination. The right front's territorial assessment is the Linux winning position. The war nobody knew was being fought has already been won. Linux won it, while the commentary was watching the wrong battlefield. And the wrong battlefield's scoreboard is still showing the wrong winner. The right scoreboard is the global computing infrastructure. The right scoreboard's winner is Linux. The war is over. Linux won.